Welcome to the continuing and ever-present goth party here on this channel. Today we're going to examine You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. I literally read this book in one day on December 29th, 2024, which kind of sucks because if I had read this earlier in the year, it would have without a doubt been in my best reads of 2024. It was meant to be like a one-off curiosity casual read because Camilla Bruce is coming out with a new book in January. That book in particular intrigued me a lot. So I was looking for something else in like a subscription service that I could read from her to see if it was worth my time, which brought me to her original debut, You Let Me In. Obviously, I found this book addictive, mesmerizing, amazing, and as always, it's in one of my favorite categories, either gothic literature. So I thought today we would break down the 9 different elements that could make something gothic on this channel. You only need 3 of them to qualify, and cover all the different ways that this delights the gothic reader. Starting with number 1, horror elements. Yes, but the horror here is a little bit more complex than you might see in a standard gothic novel. We open the story up with a missing main character presumed dead, and we get a little bit more about her life where we find out that she was originally accused of murdering her husband, though the jury cleared her, and then within a few years it seems like there was a murder-suicide with her father and her brother. All of this she sort of used to like catapult her huge mega stardom romance authordom. So she was/is a very wealthy woman. After a year's time has passed, her niece and nephew can inherit all that money. All they have to do, read the manuscript she left for them and communicate the secret word hidden in the manuscript to her lawyer. All of the deaths in the same family sounds like maybe she was somehow responsible, or like something or someone might be hunting her family. And almost as soon as we start reading this manuscript, we start to see that her like whole life has sort of been a horror show in different various ways, starting us off with her as a young girl, which sort of gives us that immediate concern for a fairly helpless main character, builds from there. And obviously she's telling a story that involves like the fae and a lot of magical supernatural elements, but we also know that she was diagnosed by a child psychologist who actually wrote a whole book about like her delusional fantasy life and how she created that as a coping mechanism for the horrific trauma she experienced as a child. And she intercuts like different quotes of what he believed happened with her own experience and interpretation of what happened. So we're getting these 2 sides of a story and trying to decide which one would be the worst of the 2 of them. And we're kind of spoiled for choice. Like, I don't know if it would be worse to be picked out and brutalized by a fae, or it would be worse to experience significant SA by people who are supposed to care for you and who you're supposed to trust. Her description of her imaginary friend slash fae, the Pepperman, is horrific. And the fact that she sort of like embraces him and chooses to go along with him in the fairy world and like feels special and chosen because of this, low-key indicates that things were probably not all well at home. Even if like the magic is entirely true, the fact that there was something that made her feel so out of place in the human world, so ugly and unnatural and abnormal and unwanted by her family, is in and of itself a kind of abuse and trauma. The mother-daughter relationship going on here feels so real and evocative and intense and resentful and unresolved. Even as Cassandra writes so dispassionately about so many traumatic and awful things, every time she mentions her mother, she is just like brimming with these unresolved, horrible feelings and like hatred and loathing. And she's like a 50-something adult when she writes this manuscript, and this is way behind her in the rearview mirror, and she is not okay. For me, to a certain level, the intensity of emotion she still feels about her mother and her mother-daughter relationship, that to me is a little traumatic and awful and terrifying all on its own. It's never on page mentioned that Cassandra has an inappropriate relationship with her therapist, and it's not necessarily like hinted at in the narrative, but the fact that this man was her therapist when she was a child and becomes her therapist and sort of like her advocate after she's accused of murdering her husband. Basic argument isn't that she didn't commit the murder, she was too mentally unwell to know what she was doing. And then the 2 of them continue to be friends. This man, he does ask her permission to publish a book about her case file, and he does try to sort of like obscure who she is, but everyone in her life, most people in the news and the media, know that it's her. And even though he gives all the money from selling the book to her in like a fund, I just felt their back and forth relationship, him using her case file like this while she was still alive was kind of like abusive. Him asking her when he knew how important and influential he was to her, abusive. The fact that the two of them continue to be friends, abusive. It made me really concerned about what went on in the room when it was just like a adult psychiatrist and patient relationship too. And because Cassandra is such an unreliable narrator, it's not like we're ever gonna find out or know if anything untoward happened. Somewhere along the line, some untoward things happened to her that she does not describe on page in the manuscript, but she does like describe a pregnancy abortion sort of situation. We know that there are some kind of like essay elements by someone or something, and that could include her therapist, and she also would have written around that. Which rolls me into number 2, character is king. This is a manuscript where Cassandra is telling her niece and nephew the truth of her life and what really happened around several sordid events. Considering she starts it off in her childhood and starts detailing how she felt ostracized from her own family, how she was the bad child and her sister was the good child, left her out and exposed and more vulnerable. She actually needed more support and protection than the good child did. And then like her slow introduction to the Pepperman, what the Pepperman does or doesn't do to her, and how all of these like life experiences have built into these tragedies and how she interprets them. It's a whole character study from beginning to end. A little bit, it does a great job capturing the same kind of feeling you would have got from like one of those true character studies of someone like Sybil. There's definitely like this curiosity about her feelings, her reactions, what's actually happening to her specifically, and like this lingering question about her disappearance, like is she alive, is she dead, if she's alive, where is she, drive a reader and keep them going forward in the manuscript. She sort of like predicts what she thinks her niece and nephew are doing or how they're responding to the manuscript as time goes on, like she's breaking the fourth wall and talking directly to them and what she expects their responses, and that's doing a great job characterizing them, explaining where they're coming from, how they might be feeling about things as integral to the story, and whether or not they are able to accept the inheritance as anything else is. Number 3. More poetic prose. So just to start, this novel is written in the epistolary style, opening with a news article about what's going on and then eventually moving us into the manuscript she left for her niece and nephew. So just on that alone, it's getting the poetic, stylized points. But then if you read the actual manuscript and the actual writing, it's like very melodic and poetic. It has a similar sort of flow and rhythm to it that you get in something like S.T. Gibson's Dowry of Blood. She uses a lot of metaphor, simile, a lot of evocative imagery. I just think it's beautiful and dreamlike and mesmerizing in all the best ways possible. Number 4 brings me to elements of loneliness and longing. So Cassandra grew up in a traditional American household. This means that she had a mother and a father in the household. Mother stayed home, father worked. She is the oldest of 3 children with a younger sister and younger brother. So she should be surrounded by family and never really be lonely, but she starts by talking about how ostracized, alone, ugly she felt in comparison to the rest of the family. How she was never quite like them, never had the same worries or concerns, never really saw things the same way, how even the decorative style in the household seemed to put her away from them and make her separate and other. And then we combine this extreme sense of isolation she has with the introduction of the Pepperman, a constant companion who's always there for her, but for whom, especially in her childhood, she is terrified of what he will do to the other. So she's like acting out, which is further pushing away traditional relationships, keeping him to herself. And we get to see how like her own isolation and loneliness really like wrapped her in and trapped her in this like self-perpetuating cycle. She discusses how she could have refused the Pepperman, how she could have like tried to get away from him, but by the time she realized that maybe she could or should do that, she also realized that doing that would mean that she was a lonely, ugly, awkward girl with no power or specialness that comes from being like the thrall of the Pepperman and like all the quote-unquote gifts he gives her. And eventually it's not just the Pepperman, there are like a whole cast of fake characters that she either invents or meets depending on how you're interpreting the story, and in a lot of ways it feels like she creates a whole cast of found family around her to sort of like fill in for where her family was lacking. As she grows up, the way that she ends up meeting her future husband Tommy, how they interact, how much hope and joy she's pinning on him, how she doesn't seem to understand what their relationship is, where it's going, why they have different perceptions of what's happening. All of it's like a lack of socialization and like this desperate loneliness, desire to belong, fit in, to have someone, like a human someone outside of this sort of like weird fae culture she's part of. Number 5. Delving into human mortality. While death, murder, and disappearance loom very large in this book, I think it's actually the explanation of fae that carry this over into delving into human mortality. Because in this lore, fae are actually the spirits of dead people, and instead of moving on to whatever or just disappearing, if that's what dead people do, their desire to continue existing and continue to live is so strong that they become this creature called fae, and then to actually keep sustaining themselves, they have to feed on something that's alive. And that could be like a tree or a river or like a certain kind of animal. In the Pepperman's case, he chooses to feed on Cassandra. And that's like what links the two of them. And feeding on a person is like an especially strong sense of life for whatever kind of reason, which gives him like more power. And also whatever the fae eat makes them more like that thing. If they're feeding off of the energy of a tree, they'll be like covered in bark and very willowy. And in the Pepperman's case, he goes from being like this very ugly, horrific kind of figure to like slowly and slowly becoming more humanized the longer he feeds off Cassandra. But the important factor here is that you can come back as a fae, sort of like blurs this line between life and death, and instead starts asking us questions about the human spirit, its fortitude, its desire to keep going on past death, and what like separates some humans who just fade off into nothingness and might even find death a relief, to like humans who are so strongly enforcing the desire to live that they're like actually continuing on as this fae character and stealing life from other things. And we do examine this like pretty in depth because there are 3 characters that sort of experience or don't experience the process of transforming from a human to a fae, and why they do or don't manage to make that journey like becomes important to who they are as a character, and how Cassandra sees life, death, being a fae, all those different realms that we're sort of like exploring through this. There's one character in specific that Cassandra keeps saying is quote-unquote too gentle for this world, where she thinks like unexistence for that particular character was actually a gift instead of something to be terrified of and avoided, which of course make the fae sort of disdain this character, right? Because it's the exact opposite of how they feel. Cassandra often stands at a point of like reserving judgment, either what's true or false, or like what's right or wrong, a neutral observer to things and not assigning ethics to it. And it's a curious thing for her to say about this character based off of the relationship they're supposed to have and the connection that seems to be trying to be made there. I think too, to a certain degree, she might like low-key be implying like different ways that different victims deal with abuse, but also it's just like the different ways that people deal with death and the perception of the end of their life. A supernatural element. Considering Cassandra believes that she was chosen by the fae and that one of them is actively feeding off of her life force, obviously there's a supernatural element. And we do all the traditional fae stuff. They're like a bridge between life and death. There's like walking of 2 realms. You get to travel to the fairy mound. You get to eat the cakes and drink the ale that they offer. They offer like these special fairy teas that give her all this like special dreaming and storytelling kind of stuff. There's a bunch of things she can see that other people don't see, and things she can hear that other people don't hear. It is an open question of whether or not this is all a delusion or whether or not it's real and magic is real, but like that's kind of a decide for yourself kind of element. In theory, yes, there is supernatural going on here. And that rolls me right into questioning a character's mental health. Again, since we have 2 sides of this story, one where Cassandra is presenting all the mythic, fae, magical, larger-than-life things that have happened to her. And on the other side, the psychologist wrote a book about her childhood trauma, these fantasy fairy tales being like an adapting coping mechanism that got her through extreme trauma, and him like theorizing about what really happened underneath the fairy tale. It gets paired side by side here. You can choose to believe Cassandra, you can choose to believe with a psychologist. You can believe both of them are real to a certain extent. There are a lot of options there. But there's definitely a strong insinuation that even if the psychologist is wrong about a lot of the conclusions he draws, Cassandra really might not be mentally well. And certainly that seems to be the belief of her surviving family, despite the fact they don't believe what the psychologist says either. Makes use of local folklore, superstition, and myth. So all of the stuff that I'd expect to see in a fae story is here. I love that they included the mound, that feels like very traditional and timeless and connected to its original lore. Again, the fairy cakes, the ale, the fairy dancing into the night. These are all plucked straight from myths about fairy. Although it's put into a modern setting, we don't incorporate necessarily like modern elements to it. It's just there existing right alongside the modern world as like this timeless other world that's always been there and always will be. And lastly is going to be a strong sense of place. And while I could picture the fairy mound, and I can picture that overly quaint white room that Cassandra lived in as a child, and I can even picture her home with Tom and later her own home by the woods, none of these places are actually like their own character in the way that we expect in Gothic literature. I love the description of everything. I can picture it. I feel like it was a good setting and it does a great job like illustrating some elements, but we could have set it in a lot of different places. We could have described these things a lot of different ways and it wouldn't have very much changed what was going on. There's definitely not an emotion that these places are projecting or that they seem to own or like foreshadow within the story. So overall, I'd say that You Let Me In has 8 of the 9 Gothic elements, and it's this really colorful and dark and gruesome yet triumphant kind of story. It draws so many strong emotions that are going all the separate ways for me while reading it that it just feels really complex, beautiful, thrilling, depressing, all at the same time. I think I described it like cottagecore themed if we acknowledged all the dirt and grime and slime that comes with living out in the woods and farming and stuff. And I think that's really apt. It's taking those elements that we've idealized, acknowledging that those are good, and it's also bringing in the real life dirt, muck, and unpleasantness that would go with it. It's a super unusual read. It's beautiful in so many ways. If you haven't read it, I really think you should check it out. I definitely am going to read more from Camilla Bruce in the future. But talk to me in those comments down below. Do you have a really unusual goth read I should pick up next? Or have you read this book and do you have your own thoughts and feelings you want to share? And as always, keep reading.